All right, now we should be able to get everything going. Okay, good. So I wanted to just spend a moment to reflect on a couple things in the news before we jump back into what we've been talking about, and obviously we're kind of jumping back and forth a little bit between a sustained discussion of the political implications of current economic trends and on the other hand, what's happening in the world, because important things are happening in the world. Among those things, and it's really just a kind of anniversary, this is the beginning of the third year of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And I think there are a few different things I would like to take that occasion to reflect on. One of them is the apparent growth in stature of Vladimir Putin within Russia. His growing confidence is as reflected in the fact that he seems perhaps to have felt the license to kill his main domestic rival, and to think that he could do so with impunity. The fact that there is growing admiration for him specifically and for his brand of aggressive strongman nationalist politics in many other places in the democratic world. And so I think if we need a reminder of the critical juncture we are in world political history as we enter, the last years of the first quarter of the 21st century, we don't need to look further than what's happening in the Ukraine. And then I want to point out the second aspect of this: the Russians are beginning to make greater advances in their efforts to conquer the territories they claim in the eastern Ukraine. And we can note the parallel with Georgia, right, where those breakaway republics are now no longer part of that country. And that at least part of the reason, I don't want to assign complete blame for the incapacity of the Ukrainians to defend their own territory, for the failure of their counteroffensive. I don't want to lay it entirely at our doorstep. I do think the intrinsic asymmetry between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Russians are a much bigger country. They have a much more developed military industrial complex because they're an authoritarian society. They're able to direct more of their resources into the war effort and conscript more of their people into it. They have many more people and a willingness to sacrifice wave after wave, tens of thousands of troops in order to gain very small amounts of Ukrainian territories. That's not our fault. That's the nature of the situation. But having said that, the Ukrainians have fought with tremendous valor. We, many other observers, many Ukrainians believed that they would fall to the Russians within weeks. Many Ukrainians rushed to the front lines, never having held a gun before, and fought to prevent the Russian onslaught from reaching Kiev and decapitating the regime, right, taking out the government, and then fought valiantly on many fronts to forestall the Russian advance, eventually to take back fair amount of the territory the Russians had captured, and then it slowed down into a war of attrition with the Russians and their tactics being one of essentially just wearing down the Ukrainians, with the Ukrainians and their allies trying to make it a war of asymmetrical attrition, in which the losses on the part of the Russians were so great that they either perhaps destabilized Putin's regime or else at least made Putin consider a more advantageous armistice for the Ukrainians. And the United States, and in particular, our Congress has undercut that strategy of asymmetrical attrition, of making this so costly for the Russians that they have to slow down, reconsider, not just continue to wear down the Ukrainian resistance. And we have done this for um, domestic political gains. That there are some genuine concerns about corruption in Ukrainian military operations. There are some concerns that not all of the arms we give them will be used exclusively to fight the Russians. But to be honest, that's not the reason. And I think it's quite clear that the Republican Party has held up the delivery of greater military aid to the Ukrainians. The reason is for domestic political advantage, trying to get a more severe approach to immigration through Congress. Once they actually succeed in negotiating that bill, undercutting it in order to um, not deliver a victory to Joe Biden in an election year. And so I do think one of the things we have to recognize is that in addition to the growing stature of Vladimir Putin and his brand of politics in the democratic world in the 2020s, it's also the case that the United States is diminished as a superpower, committed to the maintenance of a certain kind of international order, which it's both been the architect of and the anchor for decades now. And that order, I have plenty of criticisms of it. I don't think we've always been a good or a fair actor, but I think we need to recognize that as flawed as it is, some order is better than no order, and that the apparent incapacity of the United States to support its allies, to keep its promises, to shore up international order as needed, is being seen as a green light to many other bad actors in the world who will do things that will result in civilian deaths and in unnecessary deaths, in the brutality and awfulness of war, and that will be bad for the interests of the United States, not only because we should be concerned whenever innocent people die wherever they are in the world, but also because we are beneficiaries of a more stable, more integrated, more globalized world. And I want to be as clear as possible, right? I'm about to start talking about domestic inequality, which I think is in part connected to globalization. We're not um, doing as well as we should be in structuring globalization so that it is advantageous to the less well-off people in our own society and the world. But again, the comparison here is not between what we have and what we could have. I think that's a relevant comparison, but the comparison is between what we have had and what would happen if this order began to decay. And that I think would be worse for us and worse for everyone. So that's item from the news number one that we'll come back to, I hope, speaking about at greater length. The second thing I'd like to just note for a moment is that there was an important Alabama Supreme Court decision this week, which afforded the protections of legal personhood to um, uh, eggs that had been inseminated as part of an IV in vitro fertilization therapy process. And to be as clear as possible, the stage in the protocol was one where they had not yet been implanted. So there was no sense that these were viable in the threshold that has been established in American law and the Casey decision, that a fertilized egg not in a body has no capacity to sustain itself. But having said that, two things I really want us to pay attention to. One of them is the basis for the decision and the way in which the Alabama Supreme Court and its Chief Justice used obviously religious grounds to reach this decision, made no pretense that they were respecting the separation of church and state or the right to religious freedom embedded in the First Amendment to the Constitution. This is part of an ongoing effort to impose a religiously grounded ethics on those who do not those who not only reject the conclusions of the ethics, but the basis, right? It's an effort to impose religion using the coercive power of the state to criminalize behavior that does not comport with the religiously grounded ethics that don't seem to have any secular basis. And that this is, I think, again, a growing trend in the United States, an effort to coercively reimpose tradition that is not being organically or spontaneously carried by large portions of our population. And I want to be as clear as possible. Three-quarters or more of Americans not only reject the conclusions that the Alabama Supreme Court reached, they also reject the reasoning that grounds those conclusions, the idea of compulsory and fairly fundamentalist Christianity. And so again, I just think we have to be alert to the idea that there's another seismic shift occurring in our politics. And by the way, if the US Supreme Court upholds the Alabama Supreme Court's decision, that will be an earthquake in constitutional law. I don't think they will, but I'm far less confident that they will than I was 5 years ago before the Trump appointees of arch conservative justices, some of whom at least seem to be quite sympathetic to the Alabama courts holding and the grounds for it in an imposition of religious morality on those who reject the religious basis for that morality. The second thing I want to say is, right, watch out. We are increasingly in culture war politics, and not of the kind where I disagree with you and you disagree with me about our values. That's never comfortable. And depending upon how much respect, how much civility we show each other, that can be more or less destructive. But we add to that federalism, the fact that different states have different court systems, can make different laws, and we are increasingly looking like the United States looked prior to the Civil War on issues to do with women's rights to control their fertility, their bodily integrity, what is done with things that they think that they are in control of, like fertilized eggs, being removed from their control. And this is different from the Civil War in the sense that there was a group, African Americans, who had been excluded from citizenship, excluded from rights, and a group including African Americans and also white abolitionists, as well as people who did not want to see slavery extended into new states that were in tension with those who were trying to maintain the status quo of slavery in the South and perhaps extending slavery into new states. This is different because we're not trying to extend rights to persons who don't have them. We're trying to take away rights. We are starting to take away rights from people who are accustomed to having them. And I just want to suggest again, this is a fracture line in American politics, and we should be deeply concerned that this is going to up the temperature on our culture wars, on our political rivalries. It's going to make it more and more difficult to accept the outcomes of elections as deciding these issues, as opposed to suggesting that if the outcome of the election is not one we like, we should reject the election as inherently corrupt or the capacity of the election to decide these issues. And so let me pause for a second. Obviously, I do want to speak with you about the ongoing topic, but I also want to hear, do you have questions, thoughts, comments on the two issues, the what's happening with Russia, Ukraine, American assistance, or what's happening in Alabama, and the cultural politics to do with women's ability to control their procreative autonomy? If not, I will get back to the other issues. But I can't tell. John, it looks like you were starting to say something. No, yes, no. Okay. Then let me jump back into the main topic if there aren't thoughts or comments about that. And those are topics I'm pointing to because I think they're important that we notice them as they enter, right, the news. We will speak about them in greater length soon. So we've been talking now for some weeks about 21st century economic trends and their political implications. You may note that I've shifted the subtitle as well as the art from inequalities harms, that's a typo on my part. Sorry, that should be y with a possessive s. Inequalities harm to policies to address the curse of wealth. um, and as you can see, I like contrasting these two paintings. Manet's The Old Musician, who's been kicked out of Paris so that Paris can modernize, and looks back at us to say, how could you make your modernization at my cost without taking me into account, right? It's an accusatory stare of the economically marginalized, contrasting that with Diego Rivera's representation of an idealized account of industry in Detroit as an egalitarian, inclusive, cooperative enterprise. And the idea that we have moved from Rivera's, or you might say Roosevelt's, political economy back to Monet's, or a 19th century unregulated political economy in which let harm fall on whomever it will, however it will, and that we need to reverse course. We need to move back, is, if you will, in the direction we obtained in the middle of the 21st century. I've been setting this up by pointing out to you, and let me just review for a moment before we get into the new material, that there is very strong argumentation, analysis, historical narrative data that seems to support the conclusion that a 21st century economy, as it grows, produces greater and greater, exponentially increasing inequality, social inequality, inequality especially in wealth, but also in income, and that the compounding effect of this over time is that our societies become more and more unequal, and that this is not a bug. This is a feature of a globalized, automated, financialized 21st century capitalist economy, and that we therefore need to ask, how important is continued sustained increases in productivity growth to us? Is it worth suffering the inequality? And if, in a sense, we conclude that the benefits of the growth are outweighed by the harms of the inequality, then what kind of policies should we adopt? How should we change not just the tax rate, but the values and the very structuring terms of discourse that surround our discussion of economic policy? So the jumping off place for this conversation is the idea that there are things that we should be talking about in 2024 in an election year that we are not talking about, and not only not talking about, that our political discourse has become so thin and mean that it lacks the resources to frame the problems that we are facing and that are really damaging us as a society and driving us into more and more polarization, antipathy, negative partisanship that makes it still harder to address these problems. And so the literature that we started talking about in the last half of last week's class is the literature of the health and psychological consequences of living in a highly unequal society. And this is literature we've talked about before, but I think we really need to have the main conclusions in mind to be able to place in the scales the question of how we balance the benefits of getting wealthier as a society against the costs of becoming more unequal. And so the authors, Richard Wilkinson, Kate Pickett, Claude Steele, two of the leading public health researchers of Britain, one of the leading social psychologists of the United States, and the central diagram that we've looked at several times in the context of this course and at least a couple times before, right? This very neat correlation between the level of inequality in society and the incidence of health and social problems, where low levels of inequality tend to be strongly correlated with low levels of health and social problems, and higher levels of inequality correlated with higher levels of health and social problems. And we've noted that the index of health and social problems is quite diverse. It includes life expectancy, but it also includes obesity and social trust and social mobility and a lot of other factors. I would point out very quickly that there's an article in the New York Times today, an invited essay by Catherine Kramer, very good political scientist at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, who's done really good um, uh, scholarship in the past on the politics of resentment in Wisconsin, how the in particular rural white citizens of Wisconsin mainly turned against the welfare state, redistribution, urban elites. And so for the last few years, she and a team of scholars have been supported by the Academy of Arts and Sciences in um, conducting survey research on economic well-being in the United States. And their findings very much echo these findings. They're specific to the United States, but on an index of economic well-being, the United States scores 4.9 out of 10, right? And so just reinforcing the idea, we are among the richest, very close to the richest society in the world. And yet, for all that wealth, we don't seem to be doing very well as a society. And these diagrams, right? The idea that there are vast disparities in the rate of inequality in the wealthiest societies in the world, that the most equal societies are literally twice as equal or more than the most unequal societies. These are not minor differences, and that is strongly correlated with the level of well-being in the society, whereas the level of wealth seems to have no correlation whatsoever. Should give us pause as we look at Catherine Kramer's and other people's results. We could talk about Ann Case and Angus Deaton, deaths of despair as we have in the past. We talked about this again last week, that the United States has the highest inequality ranking of the countries constrained list now: Sweden, Japan, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And in every of these metrics. We're either the worst or every now and then the second worst, right? When it comes to life expectancy, we're 3, 4, 5 years behind these other countries. When it comes to teenage pregnancy, we're 5 times the rate of the more equal countries. When it comes to obesity, right? We're 10, 15% above where the more equal countries are. When it comes to the murder rate for all the other countries, we're 3, 4 times or higher. At, if you compare us with Japan, 10 times the murder rate. And again, I don't want to confound the explanation here. It's not all about inequality, but there's a very strong correlation with inequality. Of course, when we start talking about the murder rate, we've got to start talking about the availability of guns and the gun culture in the United States, which conflates ownership of a gun with agency and security when those things are in short supply. But having said all of that, right, it is it seems very plausible that inequality is strongly correlated with things we really should care about, like child well-being, right? Again, the UN gives us the UNICEF Index of Child Well-being, and then we can use it to measure child well-being in a whole bunch of countries. And there's a very strong correlation. More equal countries have higher levels of child well-being. More unequal countries have lower levels of child well-being. No correlation with national income per person. And one of the things we know is that children are really sensitive status barometers. At the ages of 1, 2, 3, 4, that these psychological studies demonstrate they are very attuned to their parents' level of status anxiety in different situations and different interactions. And it doesn't have to be that the parents are explicitly saying it. The stammer in the voice, the furrowing of the brow, the slope of the shoulders. The children are, as I say, incredibly sensitive to the non-verbal communication that status anxiety generates, and that we learn to pay perhaps less attention to as we mature. But this is deeply rooted in our evolved psychology that we are sensitive to this. And so the children are learning at a very young age that their parents feel status and security. The children then feel it, and it translates into reduced child well-being. One more, and there's so much data here. I'm giving us the short tour just to reinforce the basic point that there are some counterintuitive um, effects of living in a more unequal society, effects that everyone in the society should care about because it affects all of us and decreases our quality of life. All of us should care about children. We might blame their parents for bad decision making. I tend not to want to do that, given what I know about the causes of inequality, but some of us may. But do we therefore think that the sins of the parents should fall upon the children from a very young age? That doesn't seem fair or appropriate. They didn't get to choose who their parents were. Similarly, inequality and trust. And I like this example because it illustrates some of the mechanisms at work. One of the things that greater inequality does is create greater social distance, as sociologists like to call it. We're just different. We live in different neighborhoods. I was driving this morning through Yonkers, where I live, and I was looking at different neighborhoods, and the area right around the college where I teach, the houses are on large plots of land. The zoning creates that, right? So everybody's got to have almost an acre to build a home. And then I drove into a different neighborhood where the houses are all right up against each other, right? And the zoning there allows that, and the neighborhood has a very different feel as a result. That's a mark of social distance. Are you living in kind of stereotypically suburban, large plot, nice backyard, room for a pool, bigger house kind of neighborhood? Or are you living in a more urban, working class kind of neighborhood? And we see the difference. It's obvious to the eye. That's social distance between us. And do we drive different kinds of cars, wear different kinds of clothes, have different kinds of education, talk about different kinds of topic, root for different sports teams, watch different kinds of movies, read different kinds of newspapers? And if we do, then it begins to feel like the people we share our society with us are so different from us that we can't identify with them. Why do we trust each other? I lived in Hanover, New Hampshire for a while. People left their keys in their car, left their cars running with their children in them in the winter as they went into the grocery store. Didn't lock their front doors, right? It's a small college town, high levels of trust, but I think it's also a very homogenous town where everybody assumes that everybody there is associated with the university, college, is like them, is similar to them, similar enough that if you think I'm trustworthy and the people around me are like me, they must be trustworthy too, right? Whereas if you say, hmm, the people around me are somewhat different from me. They live in different homes, they drive different cars, they have different experiences. I don't know if I should trust them or not. Maybe I better protect myself. And again, among other things, being in a society with less social trust means levels of social cooperation go down and levels of stress go up. So with that information in mind, I'm now going to share this graphic, which I think captures this nicely in a pictorial form. Two pyramids, right? Each of them have the same number of layers. If you look, actually, they're the same image, just one of them has been compressed and one of them have been elongated. The squat pyramid represents, if you will, the level of inequality in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, the level of inequality in a more equal society. And the point being made through the visualization is, in a more equal society, there still is stratification, there still is inequality. People's houses are still bigger and smaller, their cars are still nicer and newer, or not as nice and older, etc. Right? But the differences are less marked, less extreme. The people are closer together. But when we transition into a more unequal society, simply by dint of becoming more unequal, we are becoming more hierarchical, more different from each other, and those differences matter more. It becomes more important to understand, where do I stand in relation to somebody else, because those differences matter more for our social fate. The experience of being at this level as opposed to at this level is greater. And so we pay more attention to it. And this then leads Wilkinson and Pickett to suggest that we have often a naive view of income inequality, and it needs to be replaced. And by the way, I have borrowed this slide from Wilkinson and Pickett. I think that if they had a more accurate title, it would be social inequality, income and wealth inequality, at least. So that the naive view is that it only matters if it creates poverty or if it seems unfair, right? And so if there are people who are precarious and suffering, then we got to do something about it. Or if there are people who are resentful because they think they're working hard, but their hard work doesn't get them ahead, then we've got to do something about it. But otherwise, why should we begrudge the rich, the high income, the wealthy, their resources? If we're reasonably secure and not convinced that it's unfair that they have so much more than us, then maybe we should just let them do what they want to do as long as we can do what we want to do. And what Wilkinson and Pickett suggest is that's a mistake. It's a mistake to think that The only harm of inequality is to those who suffer at the bottom. Here's what they say: inequality brings out features of our evolved psychology to do with dominance and subordination, superiority and inferiority. And that sentence, and again, right, these are books, and I'm drawing out the central conclusions of these books, rests on findings in ethnology and people who observe primates and observe them very closely and report on them. Francis DeWall is one of the leaders in this field, and who notice in a chimpanzee society, for instance, and chimpanzees have small social groups. It's extremely important to know your place in the hierarchy of dominance and subordination. If you're a subordinate chimp and you show inadequate deference to an alpha, a dominant chimp, you will be attacked, and it can be injurious or deadly, right? So know your place and act in the way that your place in the hierarchy dictates that you should act, or else. And part of what the people who study this suggest is that in human psychology, we have evolved, but we have also inherited aspects of that sensitivity to dominance, superiority, inferiority. The anthropology on this suggests that many human societies, before we became more complex in our social organization, when we too had small tribal societies, actually had techniques to prevent too much dominance, too much superiority from entering our social structures in order to protect all of us from what dominance does to us. It brings out these psychological traits. I'll continue, that affects how we treat each other and feel about ourselves. Inequality increases status competition and status insecurity. And that's the critical idea. We become more attuned to the differences. We compete more to show ourselves to be in a superior position, or at least not in an inferior position. Yet we're also insecure that that may not be true, may not be respected by others, and that we may end up being subordinated. It increases anxieties about self-worth, right? And again, the idea that we need to esteem ourselves, we need to respect ourselves, is deeply grounded in the findings of cognitive and developmental psychology, that we have a core human need to feel self-respect. And increase inequality increases self-doubt, anxiety about standing and status. It intensifies worries about how we are seen and judged, whether as attractive or unattractive, interesting or boring, etc. And part of what Wilkinson and Pickett are pointing out, and I think there are two things to notice here. One of them is that the way in which we infer our relative standing often has to do with relatively superficial status markers. Obviously, in a society with racial hierarchy, something as superficial as phenotype or morphology may be used to read out status difference. But in a society in which there's class hierarchy or severe differences in wealth and income, it may be the way you dress, your haircut, glasses you wear, whether your teeth are straight and white, the kind of car you drive, your address, neighborhood, square footage in your house, etc. But we don't just concentrate on the status marker. We tend to read out of the status marker the personal attributes of the person who has the superior marker of status. And when I say we tend to do this, I am alert to the fact that probably most of us don't think we do. As a matter of fact, we work very hard not to not be tricked by these superficial signs of status, but to actually judge the individual on the basis of her merits, her intrinsic qualities as a person. But nevertheless, it turns out in more unequal societies, that's harder to do. And we tend to internalize aspects of the social evaluative threat that our constant positioning, our constant looking up, looking down, judging our relative differences creates. We tend to worry that if somebody is looking down on me, it's not because I don't have the right haircut, etc. It's because there's something intrinsically deficient about me. And that creates a deep-seated kind of anxiety. So now to um, read out one of the passages, the more hierarchical a society is, the stronger the idea that people are ranked according to inherent differences of worth or value, and the greater their insecurities about self worth. Irrespective of individual differences in skills and abilities, in such countries, people's social position is taken even more as indicating their worth as superior or inferior. Inevitably, this exacerbates social evaluative threat and people's status anxiety. Social comparisons become more fraught, increasing insecurities and self worth. Everything from physical attractiveness and intelligence to leisure activities, skin color, aesthetic taste, and consumer spending take on greater social meaning in terms of rank and worth. And so I've put at the top of this diagram also one of these simple equations in sociology that I like a lot. Increased scarcity increases competition, which increases scarcity, which increases competition, right? And so in a society in which we make people feel that status is scarce, we compete more for status. That increases the sense that status is scarce and we're off to the races in a self-reinforcing cycle. To now begin to understand the implications that the causal chain that greater inequality releases in terms of greater status, anxiety, social evaluative threat, as it's being called, sense of right competition for recognition and self-worth, and the way in which that can lead us to confuse superficial markers of status for deeper issues of worth and value. The study that really got this all going was a study that Richard Wilkinson conducted in Britain in the late 1960s called the Whitehall Study. And he was interested in public health. He's a public health doctor, an epidemiologist. And in particular, he was noticing that, by the time you get to the second half of the 20th century in England, people are not dying of the things that used to kill most human beings for most of human history, not dying of contagious disease. Because, well, we have vaccinations, we have antibiotics, we have the germ theory of disease, and we've improved our sanitation and hygiene as a result. What's killing people? Well, one of the chief causes of death is heart disease, right? Not a contagious disease, but a disease that seems to be triggered by other factors. Well, what are those factors? And the literature suggests that high levels of stress are actually strongly correlated with heart disease, that stress is one of the most important pathogens in a society that has brought contagious disease under control. Well, what is the relationship between stress and higher rates of mortality. And this is where Wilkinson really began to do pioneering work that isn't, I guess, traditional public health work, but has really important ramifications for how we pursue health in a society. So he started looking at Whitehall and at the civil servants working in Britain, and he devised a metric to differentiate low from high stress working conditions. And to take a simple example, you could be a secretary with an abusive and unpredictable boss, right? Doesn't tell you when something is due, but then wants it that day. And if it's not available that day, is screaming at you as a result, right? And so that would be a category of highest stress work environment. And of course, you're coming into that environment 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, and you're therefore experiencing chronic stress. You're not just right when somebody cuts me off on the road, I might get angry, I might hit my horn. If I'm being the better self, I'll just take a deep breath and say they're the idiot, not me. But right, sometimes you can't avoid acute stress in your life. But this is different, right? This is if I'm going to get my paycheck, I've got to get myself into an environment every day that triggers a lot of stress. Sorry, I accidentally advanced the slide. And then there are people who have a very low stress work environment. And he studied them for a long time and looked at, in particular, their relative risk of death. And as you can see, the people who have the lowest rates of chronic stress related to work have an incidence of death, a risk of death that is less than half the level of the people with the highest stress levels. And that there's a very clear relationship, again, as the stress level goes up, and it seems to have little cliffs or climbs built into it. As the stress level goes up, the incidence of death goes up. And so this is the beginning of understanding why social evaluative threat is such a strong predictor of overall social health and well-being. That it's not just that these two things go together, maybe there's some third variable explaining them, but that we can begin to identify the causal mechanism, the reason why being in a more unequal society makes it a less healthy society. It is because the inequality generates social evaluative threat in a diffuse way. It's there in all our interactions all the time. We are, when we're in a more unequal society, like the secretary with the bad boss, constantly exposed to chronic stress. This then is and I want to be careful here. I think that these studies um, maybe exaggerate the confidence with which they measure things. How do we know comparable levels of status anxiety across different societies? Having said that, they give us a basic finding that I think is quite plausible and worth contemplating. And so the way this diagram works, right, it shows you status anxiety levels in countries with high inequality, medium inequality, and low inequality. And then it shows you those levels of status anxiety for the people who are poorest in the society, and then going up by 10% groups to the people who are wealthiest in those societies. And here's, I think, the really important thing to take away from this imprecise but still illuminating research. This is the richest 10% in a high inequality society. This is the relatively less well off people in a middle um, inequality society, not extreme, not low, right? Please note that the richest people in a high inequality society are feeling something like the same level of stress as the lower middle class in a medium inequality society. And then if we compare with a low inequality society, the high inequality people are feeling the richest high inequality people are feeling the same stress as the poorest low inequalities society people. One way to put this is if you want to be healthy, if you want to have a high level of well-being, you maybe would rather be a relatively poor person in a relatively equal society than the richest person in a high inequality society. So even if I'm not making an argument based in justice, we should care about the well being of those who are less well off in our society. And of course, I am attracted to that kind of argument. But let's say for a minute, I'm not. I'm just purely self interested. I got mine, and that's all that I care about. And by the way, there's a lot more of that in our society as we've become more unequal. I still am making a mistake if I say, well, it's a worthwhile trade off. Let's have higher inequality and higher wealth because I do better in that society. Well, it turns out no, you may be richer, but you're actually experiencing higher status anxiety. And that is bad for you. That is bad for your children. That is bad not just for the people at the bottom of the society, but also the people at the top of the society. And so I think that that's an extremely important way of understanding why our political discourse around the economy has become so distorted. We focus entirely on the growth of our economy, on the creation of new jobs, of greater overall productivity, without asking, are those jobs good jobs? Are those jobs that make people better off in terms not only of the income that they derive from them, but in terms of the satisfaction with the work that they do and with the quality of life that that income affords them in this society. One of the things that I think is perplexing many people right now is look, Joe Biden has, over the course of 3+ years in the presidency, presided over an economy that has created more jobs than almost any other period in American history. We've managed to get inflation under control without ending up in a recession. The jobs that are being created are exactly the jobs we need. They're industrial jobs and they're located in areas that have been hardest hit by deindustrialization. You may have seen, I don't know, David Brooks did an article, an op-ed on this in the New York Times just a day or two ago. And his article argues that the reason that Joe Biden is not getting credit from working class Americans, despite the fact that his presidency has seen these dramatic increases in jobs for them, is because their values are different than those of the college educated that tend to vote for the Democrats. I think Brooks has it completely wrong. That the issue, yes, there are value differences, and yes, they matter to the way in which we vote. We don't vote exclusively about our economic interests, but you need to add to this, by the way, a job in 21st century America is not as valuable, does not deliver the well being that a job in the middle of the 20th century did when working people regularly voted for the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party was better at creating jobs for them and looking out after their interests. This is a fundamentally different diagnosis. Our economy, even when it grows and produces value for the people at the bottom 50%, is not making them better off, not making us better off. And we need to start having a conversation about what it would be like to have an economy that didn't just create income, wealth, jobs, productivity, but also secured well being, health, mutual respect, and social security, right? And that is a different kind of conversation, and it's one that frankly we don't seem well equipped to have. Let me just preview for a second where I want to take this. And in the title to today's class, I spoke about the ways inequality harms us and policies that might begin to address this. I want to, as we move forward, start first in talking about values. And here I want to suggest that our current political discourse conflates increased productivity, wealth, income, jobs with social well being, and that we need to take it back to basics. We need to ask, what are the values that we want to appeal to in having a conversation about how our economy should be structured and regulated? And so that's the first part of this conversation. What are those values? And I'm going to call these shared values of a democratic political economy. And in part, I'm saying that to emphasize we, as I suggested, about what happened in Alabama with in vitro fertilization and the rights of eggs, that we are increasingly polarized about values, that there are increasingly wedge issues that split us apart. Can we identify some values that might bring us together as we begin to discuss how we should improve our economy? So from there, I want to then, I've got a whole list of values, begin talking about reform. And I want to talk about experimentation in trying to figure out what works to make an economy that realizes the values that we are actually able to agree on as what we want out of our economy. And I'll point out to you very quickly that when Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his brain trust and the New Deal started trying to figure out what to do about the Great Depression, the approach they took, they called, I imagine this is familiar to many of us, a spaghetti at the wall approach, right? The idea being, one way to figure out if your spaghetti is cooked, is done, you throw it at the wall. And if it sticks to the wall, then it's done, right? And the idea behind the experimentation of the New Deal was we don't know what works to restore a fairer, more secure, more cooperative economy. So let's try some experiments and see what works. If it doesn't stick, it doesn't stick. But if it does, then we can work on developing that as a national program. And my suggestion is that after we've identified some values that could guide political reform, we should start experimenting with policies that might work, recognizing that we don't really know what works for a 21st century economy. We can't just go back to the New Deal ideas. Nice if we could, nice if we had maintained them. We haven't. We have a globalized, automated, information based, financialized economy. We're going to need new policies for it. So that's where I want to take us. But first, I want to open things up for conversation about the ideas I've shared with you today. Who wants to start us out in terms of thinking about what greater inequality does to us socially, psychologically, why it's worse off, even for the best off in our society?
David,
Yes?
Stan.
Oh, hi. Yep. Now I see you.
Well, what occurs to me is that it's very difficult. We are so divided and so far apart at the ends of our society between the top parts. I'm not even talking about the 001s, just even the top, maybe 1%, and the bottom. And so many of these ideas are entrenched that we're here because we deserve to be here, or we've worked for it. I don't know, without maybe some real civil disobedience, we're going to get any, it's not going to get the attention it needs to do so, to try to fix it.
Yeah,
That's,
and civil disobedience, I'm gonna broaden it out and say a social movement, right? And so in other contexts, right? This is Black History Month. We're coming to the end of it. I'm talking with some people about some of the scholarship on the civil rights movement and the idea that it was a long movement, that we tend to pay most attention to what happened in the 1950s and 1960s, but that actually a fair bit of what's most important occurred in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, when that movement was building its capacity for organization, beginning to do the hard work of trying to establish legal precedents. And so, yes, we're going to need more than a politician getting up and saying, let's come together around these values. We're going to need efforts in civil society. You're pointing in particular to, I've earned it, it's mine, right? And part of my argument is that's actually not healthy for even the people who are coming out on top, right? So let's appeal
I
to the,
agree.
yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead,
I
go
agree.
ahead.
I agree with that. I just think that um, we need that long buildup, and that's not happening. I mean, we're going to need some abruptness to make us even aware that we have a problem.
Yeah, yeah, and I hate to say it, but I think in some sense we've seen some of it, right? The invasion of the Capitol on January 6th, 2021. What's going on there, right? The please note that the people were chanting, "This is the people's house," right? The House of Representatives belongs to the people of the United States, but the people who are in it are not doing the business of the people of the United States. Therefore, the people of the United States need to take it back. At that level, I almost agree with those statements. But then you got to ask, what are they actually, there for? They're there to disrupt the electoral college so that Donald Trump can have a second term. And so it's being channeled, the grievance, the sense of unfairness, the idea that the system is rigged. And again, Catherine Kramer's work, which has just recently come to my attention, that the new project with the Academy for Arts and Sciences, it shows that the vast majority of Americans do think that the economy is rigged against them. But if all we have is Donald Trump offering that message, then we are in trouble, right? And so, yes, we need some way to change the discourse and to bring awareness to it. I just want to point out, that I think protest politics, civil disobedience works only when the groundwork has been laid for it, right? And so you don't get success in the civil rights movement until you have Louis Brandeis and W.E.B. Du Bois and a whole bunch of lawyers and a whole bunch of organizers with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference putting in place everything that needs to be there before you can start having sit-ins at lunch counters. And so I guess all I'm saying, Ann, is I don't disagree with you. I just think it's got to be a longer, more sustained campaign.
I agree that that's the long one, but I think that the awareness of it is going to come in little bits too.
Yeah.
There will have to be abruptness in places.
And we need to restore some confidence that we have the capacity to change this economy through strikes, through protests, through elections. I think right now there's a great deal of defeatism, and that's giving rise to a great deal of cynicism. And then, angry protest politics of the kind we see on January 6th, not constructive protest politics of the kind that Martin Luther King Jr. was so good at mobilizing. I've got a couple other people trying to get in, so I'm going to go to David first and then Flossie. So David, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to, first of all, agree with you about your characterization of MAGA movement as a social movement. I think it is a social movement, and I think the problem is that if you look at what Ann wants, we need a social movement that moves us in a different direction, and that's what we seem not to be able to muster. Those who are on the liberal progressive end of the political spectrum. But I want to go back to the interaction that you showed between personal wealth, societal inequality, and stress, and that I found that fascinating. But there were two factors that I wanted to put into the equation. I was wondering if any of the studies actually had. One would be perceptions of social and economic mobility, the degree to which that influences that outcome, and the other is the perception of civil rights and liberties, because it seems to me that we have to know what happens in societies that vary along those two dimensions in terms of the finding that you showed us.
Yeah, great question, David. And you may notice, and I'll come to you in a minute, Flossie. I see that you got your hand up. The Great Gatsby curve, which I don't have in today's slide, but which I was showing you last week, right? That societies that are more unequal are also societies with lower levels of social mobility. And then the recent work by David Leonhardt arguing that in a society with a lower level of social mobility, you tend to have less, let's call it cultural confidence, less confidence in the idea that yours is a progressive society, that yours is a society that rewards hard work, that it makes sense to sacrifice for your future or to sacrifice for other people's well-being in your society. So I think the issue of mobility is well studied, and it goes along with it in tandem with inequality. The second issue you raise, what about the protection of rights? I'm less sure about that. I'm less confident in what I'm about to say, because I'm not sure we have as good as studies on it. But I think it goes back to kind of Leonhardt's observation, which is when you believe that you can express your need, interest in equality or fairness or opportunity, and that those in positions of power, whether they are your elected officials or people who exercise economic and social power, hear you, listen to you, but more than that, actually take seriously your claims and act on them unless there are good reasons not to, then you have a sense of agency, a sense that you can influence the structural features of your social world that affect your fate, right? And we want to feel some capacity to be able to affect our fates, to be in some meaningful sense, if not in charge, at least empowered in the way in which our efforts, our interests, our arguments translate into some kind of capacity to control our lives. And that's deeply woven into the fabric of a democratic political culture, right? That's part of the idea. Yes, it's better to live in a democracy because I can exercise some influence over my social fate as a result. And I'm really worried that we're seeing what political scientists call democratic backsliding. People with less confidence that democracy matters, less willing to participate in political uh, action, including voting, and more willing to throw down with extreme parties that may be hostile to democracy. Why is that? In part, it seems to me because democracy doesn't seem to be working as well for us in the 21st century in these regards. This is more my analysis than the stuff that I've seen data that really supports. But I think you and I are barking up the same tree, at least on this, David.
One final very small point, that is that the same phenomena you see, that there are independent contributions of the inequality in the society and the personal income. There's a similar effect in education. That is the income level, the average income level of a school you attend influences achievement independently of family income. So that's for a poor kid in a poor school, you get a double whammy.
Yeah, and there's a really good study I think I've cited before, Jay McCloyd's "Ain't No Making It," right? This idea that if all of your peers around you say, why bother doing your homework? It's not going to have any impact on your life. This is just a stupid hoop that the grown-ups make us jump through, and we're all going to end up, being the servants of the wealthy. Then it's hard to buck, right? That peer influence. But if some of your peers say, well, actually, my parents teach me that hard work matters, it may rub off on some of the kids. And so the idea that peer socialization was more conducive to social mobility when kids went to mixed income schools as opposed to segregated schools, and that we've transitioned as we've segregated our neighborhoods by income and wealth, we've segregated our schools by income and wealth, and the result is that
what happens?
Go ahead, Flossie.
We are not born equal. We are not born equal. Some of us are stronger physically. Some of us have better brains. We have the history of utopias that start off with the best intentions and have become rotten. We have the history of the communes that were formed in the 60s and 70s and went blotto. So there's something missing, and it has to do with biology as well as good wishes and good hope. You brought in the classrooms. You could bring in the best run camps. What happens? Where do you see the leaders coming from? How do the leaders get started? They get started because there's something called genes. We are equipped to become leaders. We can be destroyed because we are too smart. But we have to take into consideration that we are born with certain gifts, and that those of us who are born with certain gifts have to be educated on how to use them. Where does that kind of leadership come from? And who is responsible for deciding where that leadership comes from? Something is missing in the way we look at equality. What is it really? We're just beginning, I think, to look at it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Flossie. And I can't do justice to the complexity of the topic you've just raised, right? Especially not with already having gone 15 minutes over. But having said that, let me just point out two things that I would want us to think about. One of them is the basis for moral and political equality seems to me to be independent from the kinds of genetic inequality that you're talking about. And I don't doubt that there is real, I mean, it's obvious, right? On average, men run faster than women, right? And we have some sense of what's going on in the hips and the composition of the muscle. And the biological reasons why our bodies differ from each other's, right? So the genetic differences are in some sense obvious, but having said that, that doesn't create the difference in rights, in standing, that maybe previous cultures who thought that the strong just got to prey on the weak do, right? And so we have a core modern idea that irrespective of that range of differences, we're all morally equal, and hopefully that translates into equal political rights. That doesn't mean everyone should just draw a straw and see who becomes president. We want someone who's well qualified, who has the right temperament, who has the right experience, who has the right intelligence, who has the right compassion, right? And so yes, those differences are relevant. And then that raises the second question, right? How much of the distribution of income, of wealth, of leadership tracks the differences in relative capacity and the effort we've spent in cultivating and developing it? And again, we spoke about this a little bit last week. All of the money that people who have it are spending on making sure that their children get into the best schools, and how the smartest poor kids are less likely to graduate from college than the slowest rich kids, right? And that's just that there's something upside down about the way in which opportunity is being distributed in the United States today. And so, yes, we should want every Mozart, every Einstein, every Da Vinci to be found and to be given the opportunity to develop their capacities to do things that are great for the world. And that we need a society that allows the people who have talent to develop that talent and share with the rest of us what that talent allows them to do. And I just don't think that's the society we live in the 21st century. Education matters hugely, so does culture, but so do concentrations of income and wealth when they're used to monopolize, to hoard advantages for the children of the already privileged. I think that might be a good note for us to leave off on today. Obviously, going through some deep waters right now. It's good that you guys are raising these issues, and we will continue. I want to look at those values and those policies that might begin to do the good work that Flossie and
Thank
David and
you
others are.
very much.
My pleasure as always, Flossie. Thank you. Keep bringing it. Look forward to seeing you guys next week. Okay.
Yeah.
Take care, everybody. Thank you very much. See you next Saturday. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David.